so many powerful and relevant foundations, and I hope to be able to build on some of these. And I think in particular what you were just talking about in terms of power segues into some of the information I want to provide. And as you mentioned with the Bonilla Silva reading, we get a context here for power and institutional forms of power, systemic forms of power. And I want to play off of these notions today. If you had an opportunity to look at the readings, if you didn't, you can certainly find these online. They're very accessible, available for you free. In addition to Bonilla Silva, we gave you Peggy McIntosh's piece from 1988, White Privilege, Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack. Very important piece in dealing with privilege. Another piece that contextualizes her work many years later from the New Yorker, a series of interview questions, and then a version of some of McIntosh's work via a survey that you can take online. You can get your privilege score, and they ask you a slew of questions about your everyday life and so forth. I wanted to begin then with the notion of what privilege is, and if you look at the meaning of privilege etymologically, and this probably strikes us as familiar to our understandings, you can see Dr. Ponce talked about the legal foundations that established a lot of this in the Constitution, in our legal system, in our political system. We see this certainly here in terms of the meaning of privilege as something that is written into law, that is either in favor or against an individual, and it's also some form of advantage that is granted. And so I'd like to suggest today, to build on what Dr. Ponce was saying, that we can think of privilege in everyday contexts, either everyday advantages that some people have, or everyday disadvantages that other people have. And later we'll talk about the intersection of some of these advantages and disadvantages in some important senses. To go back to the McIntosh piece, I think what's so important about this piece, I remember teaching, the piece was written in '88, I remember teaching it in a race and ethnicity seminar back in 1997, and in a very diverse class in terms of ethnicity and gender and orientation and social class and background. And people certainly disagreed on some of the issues that were raised in McIntosh's piece, but it opened many people's eyes. It had this ability to just startle people and to come to realizations maybe that they hadn't before. So from this New Yorker piece, you can see when they interviewed McIntosh many years later, said, I had to ask myself on a daily basis, what have I done or what do I have that I didn't earn? And I think what is so important is that this goes against, and Dr. Ponce mentioned this fallacy of meritocracy. If everyone works hard in a capitalist society, in a free market society, I can get an education, I can get a job, I have opportunities. It's a fair system, it's a free market system. Everybody has opportunity. Well, we've heard in the last half hour already that that's not the case. Legally, politically, economically, and I'll talk about the racialized criminal justice system in a bit. We recognize, hopefully, that this is not the case. So one of the things I think that McIntosh's piece and reflections on it so many years later forces us to realize is that it's not a fair system. It's not a meritocracy, and it's not equality for all, even though we have that thing called the Bill of Rights, right? The Bill of Rights makes this claim, and indeed mission statements of colleges and communities often talk about this notion of fairness and equality. To go back to her piece, and I won't share all of these with you today, but if you had a chance to look this over, you see there's incredible relevance, I think, in McIntosh's work for the fact that she focuses on the quotidian or the everyday context of how people experience or don't experience the world. And I want to pick up on this notion later. Just because I don't see something or understand something doesn't mean that it's not happening. And in the social sciences, we realize this fully, that I can't use my own view of the world as a lens to see the world and make the assumption that if I'm not seeing it, it's not happening. And I think we see this in the context of police violence, racialized police violence in the wake of Ferguson and many other cases. So we can look at a few of these. Number one, McIntosh again asks each of us to introspectively look at these and ask the question, do you answer yes or no to this? So number one, I can, if I wish, arrange to be in the company of people of my race most of the time. Number four, I can be pretty sure that my neighbors in a particular location will be neutral or pleasant to me. And some of these off this list have been taken, again, turned into web surveys. One very powerful one that I think is just so telling, again, in its everyday, unspoken nature, is the color of a Band-Aid, right? So you say, well, what does it mean to have a flesh color Band-Aid? Is it going to look like my skin color, and is the presumption that flesh, the neutral term, that equates with white? And if that's the assumption, that talks about, again, this notion that there's embedded into our everyday experiences ideals, certain ideals that we have to challenge and hopefully overcome. And that's the significance of this piece. And to go on to discuss the significance, again, this is from the New Yorker article, if you had a chance to look at this. And the interviewer asked, why have you talked about this notion of privilege? And you've done so in a very compassionate way. And again, I would say that people maybe disagree with some of the work of McIntosh, and I'll talk about this disagreement in just a second. But one of the things that's key is it forces, if you read the piece and if you apply just a little bit of introspection to it, it forces you to think about your own experiences. And she quotes in this interview the important feminist writer, thinker, political activist Adrienne Rich, who said that in the basis of a women's studies classroom, nobody ever has to tell a student in that classroom or an educator in that classroom that we have to study our lives. We make our lives a study. And again, if people experience racial profiling, people experience homophobia, people experience violence against themselves because they're transgender, those are experiences that are already internalized, and hopefully communities can grow around individuals who've been victimized, and there can be dialogue and embracing of opportunities for change, as we talked about in the first half hour. And I think it's important that McIntosh is saying here that you have to let students testify to what they know. And we often do this in a social science classroom. When teaching a gender class, we very openly talk about issues, and we discuss and we debate and we challenge people based on their own ability to relate to their experiences and to relate to their lack of experiences, that they haven't experienced something. Again, if you haven't experienced racial profiling, it doesn't mean that racial profiling doesn't exist. And that's why we need testimony in classroom settings, in community settings, among activists and everyday people who want to challenge these systems that we're addressing today. Now, I wanted to mention this because it comes up in the New Yorker article, and specifically there was a freshman, Tahoe, back in 2014 at Princeton University, who reacted to this piece by McIntosh and other contexts of it. And specifically, he was upset because he was taking a class, and a student in the class had said, you need to check your privilege at the door. And this got him very upset, and he said, I'll never apologize for being a white male. And he talks about, it's not just based on my appearance, it's not the whole story. I've checked my privilege and I apologize for nothing. And I think what's unfortunate about this, and I'll share this bit of the interview from the New Yorker article, when Tahoe was told check her privilege, which is a flip, get with it kind of statement, it infuriated him because he didn't want to see himself systemically. And I think that's a real key to talk about today, is this notion of looking at ourselves in a systemic sense. Not just looking at ourselves in the sense of our everyday experiences and our own commitments or abilities to deal with some of these issues on a personal level. And McIntosh talks about that whiteness is just one of many variables that you can certainly look at. And we'll talk about this with intersectionality in a bit. So it's not certainly just about your race and ethnicity. And she ends this part of the interview saying, this changes minute by minute, depending on where we are, who we're seeing, what we're required to do. And that's why in social science we teach the significance of context. This stuff can shift and change and alter and mutate depending on the situation, depending on the circumstance. And that's very important, and at the same time it's very challenging, because some of our terms that we use to describe things like race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, being transgender, social class, these are changing over time because of our awareness over time is changing in terms of what the media presents, in terms of our everyday experiences. And this is again key, and I really want to emphasize this today, the importance of seeing ourselves systemically when we consider these issues. As McIntosh says at the beginning of the piece, I was taught to see racism only in individual acts of meanness, not in invisible systems conferring dominance on my group. And this is key, not just systems, but invisible systems. Again, go back to what I was talking about. Someone says, well, this person was complaining about police profiling, and it didn't happen to me, so why should I believe that exists? That's the invisibility of these systems. When something is systemic, it's built into whatever we're talking about, the political system, the economic system, and so forth. To go back to etymology, when we talk about a system, it's the whole creation. It's the universe, it's the arrangement, it's how all the pieces are put together to make up the whole, and thus it's a challenge in overcoming that particular system. It's how things are organized, how they are formed in order. And in short, we may say then, when something like this is systemic, when privilege is systemic in form, it's all-encompassing. It affects people at multiple levels of their everyday lives. We could, of course, talk about and should talk about individual experience. And all of us have had experiences likely in here with people being mean with one another, with forms of stereotyping. You feel the lack of fairness, you feel the intolerance, and certainly, as they say in the gender class that I teach, we should be concerned about that regardless if we are, on an everyday basis, victims of oppression, racialized, sexualized, genderized, whatever those happen to be or not. But at the same time, we can't forget that things aren't systemic. Again, when things are systemic, we're talking about systemic patterns of denial, oppression, and privilege that have a legacy. What it means then is they're written into the social, political, economic fabric of our everyday lives, our institutions, and our processes. And to reflect on this a bit, you think about how would this affect you if you're denied an opportunity to get a job? How does it affect you socioeconomically? What about if you're not treated fairly in the classroom? There was a scandal years ago with someone who presumably should have been enlightened, Lawrence Summers, the president of Harvard University, and he made a statement about STEM, about science and engineering classes, and women and young girls being less competent or able to go into these fields. And it was very shocking to say, an intellectual, right, president of Harvard, how could someone like this say this? Those messages, right, again, invisible or not, in this case very visible, affect then perhaps in a math or science class or an English class how teachers treat girls and women based upon these impressions, right, these things that are written into the fabric of our everyday lives, in this case in the educational setting, which is so important to all of us today. Whether or not you are racially profiled. If you saw in the post-Ferguson climate, I'll be talking about this in a second, the comedian Chris Rock, on his social media, Twitter account and so forth, recently was posting every instance in which he was racially profiled, stopped by the police, and you saw his reaction. He kept posting these to social media. And this is one example, I think, of how celebrities can draw attention to this, because you say, well, how could someone like Chris Rock, who has, money and certainly is high on the social class ladder, how can this happen to him? What happens to him because of his skin color, because of racial profiling still being something that is embedded into our criminal justice system. Now, I want to introduce, in an important sense, and both Dr. Murillo and Dr. Ponce talked about the challenge of dealing with these issues. It's certainly not easy to go into a classroom and talk about these issues. It's not easy for us necessarily today to begin this dialogue. There are some important ways that we can begin dialogues about this. And first off, I think we have to have an internal dialogue, look at ourselves in the mirror a bit. So one of the things we can think about is two things, standpoint theory and reflexivity. Standpoint theory comes out of feminist studies and suggests that all of our knowledge is based on social positions. Knowledge is something that's socially situated, and it is reinforced or stratified, different layers, by other categories. So things like race, class, social positions, and so forth. And so standpoint theory, along with reflexivity, offer very important ways for us to consider some of these issues today. Reflexivity, this is taken from a discussion in terms of doing research, but applies to us today, is this idea that you should continually reflect on your research. You should always focus on what's called here the conceptual baggage, the assumptions and preconceptions, in such a way that it doesn't negatively taint your research. You look at the relationship of yourself to that research, and then hopefully you assure that you haven't tainted or negatively affected that research because of all those biases and preconceptions. We'll take that out of the context of research and focus on ourselves today and say, how can I think about my own biases or preconceptions? If I'm sitting in a job interview with candidates, if I'm watching TV news, I see Bruce Jenner, coming out as transgender. What's my reaction to that, right? These are all reflexive moments that we can have in our everyday lives in these very quotidian moments in which we maybe aren't thinking about these, fancy abstract terms like standpoint theory and reflexivity. Very, very key then in terms of getting us back to this question of privilege. Again, I mentioned this earlier, seeing my privilege or lack of privilege, seeing another's privilege or lack of privilege. And by applying standpoint and reflexive approaches, I don't make the assumption that just because I'm not seeing it, it doesn't exist. Social science constantly challenges us with this notion, particularly this notion of the social construction of reality Berger and Luckman talked about for many years ago. This idea that a reality exists out there, but it's a reality, as Dr. Ponce was talking about, that has been constructed by other people. There's a legacy to that reality. And so if we want to dismantle some of this, we have to look at the underpinnings and the foundations as we're beginning to do today. So that begins, I think, with this reflexive look at ourselves, questioning our own privilege, lack of privilege, looking at the privilege or lack of privilege of others around us or others distant from us. And then what I'd say is we can combine standpoint and reflexivity with systemic analyses and develop powerful forms of social awareness. And I'll just put some headlines up here. I was just Googling, police violence, and you see examples here talking about, just from the recent news, post-Ferguson, Philadelphia. Many examples. The latest, if you're watching the news in Baltimore, of course, very unfortunate events involving Freddie Gray. And I think sometimes, again, the challenge of looking at some of this stuff is it's incredibly disturbing. You watch this on the news, you see, people being shot in the back, if you saw any of that video, and it's very hard to watch. You see people rioting, you see the media maybe painting a certain picture and not focusing on other things. They just focus on the rioting, and so there's some more racialized assumptions that go into how the media is covering these events. So there's incredible challenge in looking at any of this and unpacking it. It's unsettling to us. It challenges our own preconceptions. Again, it forces us to ask some difficult questions, maybe to act on some of those questions and reactions that we have. To look at etymology, I'm always looking at meaning here, because again, meaning is very important in getting us where we're at today. The meaning of being aware, if you look at this from a German verb, is notions of caution. So being cautious about what we see, being cautious about what we think. If the reality around us is socially constructed, we need to be aware of that. We need to have awareness of the world around us. Foresight, thinking about what might be coming up, what's happened in the past, and what we might project into the future, and having some sense of care, an ethic, an ethos, a feeling, a value system of care. And care can be taken in many different ways. You can look at something carefully and say, we can't just jump to a conclusion just because we think a certain way, because we've been applying reflexive and standpoint approaches. And then we can also develop that ethic of care that says, as a community, we have challenges and hurdles that we can overcome collectively and together, instead of thinking ourselves in silos, instead of thinking ourselves as being alone in this. And there's so many studies, again, out there that talk about police brutality, and why are certain populations being targeted? Why are people of color being targeted? Dr. Ponce mentioned not enough attention to Latinos being targeted by police in these various killings. So a lot in the news right now, I think that raises maybe our consciousness meter, depending on where our consciousness meter is, raises our level of social awareness. And one of the challenges here, as we look at some of these cases, beginning with Ferguson and Michael Brown, and then continuing with Staten Island, Eric Gardner, and I could add many more cases here. The case of Walter Scott in North Charleston, and the most recent one, and unfortunately there will be others, and thus the question mark, Baltimore and Freddie Gray. Again, when you watch this on the news, I think you can react to it in some very different ways. You could turn off the TV and say, this is too disturbing to look at, or you could say, well, this doesn't affect me because I would never be in one of those circumstances because my, what we call in sociology, master status, my ethnicity, my race, my creed, my social class wouldn't put me in a position like that. Or you could look at it in a more reflexive way and again apply some of the notions we're talking about today, question power, question systems, and realize that it would be really important, right, if we could stop this next case from happening, if that was possible. And unfortunately, we know that there will be a next case, and it'll be on the news, and again, we have an opportunity to respond and to react in some ways, perhaps collectively. What I would suggest today is that This notion of social awareness, of seeing the world around us, recognizing it's a construction, recognizing the significance of taking reflexive approaches to the reality around myself and ourselves, it's a necessary challenge. And we can make the commitment today whether or not to take the social action that we were talking about for this last hour today, that necessary challenge. I want to also bring up this notion of intersectionality, because I think sometimes we assume that there are certain categories, these master statuses that we talk about in social science, and those categories exist on their own. In fact, Kimberly Williams Crenshaw, critical legal scholar from UCLA, talked about back in the late 80s this notion of intersectionality, referring to the intersections of forms of oppression and privilege. And what she suggests quite importantly here is that these forms of oppression are not only interrelated, they're bound together, they're influenced by the intersectional systems of society. And to look at some of these that have been diagrammed here on this chart, you can see on the top here, when we're talking about dominance, and again, this upsets people, right? If we talk about one group being in power and other groups not being in power, I think sometimes a reaction I get, like in a gender class, is someone says, well, I'm in one of these groups that's listed up here, and I feel bad about myself. I have guilt, or maybe I react in such a way, I overreact because I feel like someone is challenging me. And indeed, that's the point. Yes, you are being challenged, we're all being challenged. Again, this is very natural for many of us that teach in the social sciences. It's the stuff we live, breathe, and think about every day. It's what we're trained to do. But it doesn't mean we have to be reactionary when we look at this. But to understand the system, again, you can see on the top here, these are the groups in power, and then on the domination line below, these are the groups that have been typically denied power. And you can see then, how these forms intersect one another. And the notion then is that if you're a woman of color, you're going to experience the system of sexism or androcentrism, genderism. If you're a lesbian woman, again, you're going to be influenced or be affected by another system of power. You're also going to be affected by the racialized system that we've been talking about as well today. So intersectionality suggests that we look at the big picture. We look at the fact that there aren't easy categories or easy solutions to looking at these issues, but we have to see specifically the context of how these forms play themselves out in everyday forms of our lives. I want to introduce, or as we close here, talk about two additional concepts I think are important, and I don't at all, but these are cultural relativism and intercultural communication. And cultural relativism is a sense of deep respect that we develop among ourselves. We try to respect another culture, another viewpoint, without imposing our own culture or viewpoint on that culture, person, or system that we're trying to understand. And it's really hard to do. Again, if the stuff is embedded, if it's embedded in our school systems, if it's embedded in our legal system, it's embedded in our parenting, right? From an early age, maybe you're taught to act a certain way or think a certain way. Again, it's invisible to you because you haven't checked your privilege that Macintosh addressed earlier. It's very hard to do some of these things because you might think to yourself, well, I'm not being ethnocentric, I'm not against this culture or this person, but maybe you are being so because, again, you haven't deeply thought about the reality in which you're existing in this everyday sense. Intercultural communication suggests that if we create this opportunity to respect other cultures and respect other people and not impose our own value systems on those people, how can we create systems of communication that in the aftermath of all this offer dialogue among people of different backgrounds? And to go back to this notion of intersectionality, it's very broad and diverse when we're talking about the spectrum of different groups and dealing with privilege and lack of privilege and so forth. So these concepts, I think, are quite key in understanding many of these issues. What I suggest here in this model is a way of thinking about how we might deal with privilege. I've talked about these issues today, so I mentioned earlier this idea of standpoint and reflexivity. The value of critically looking at our own perspectives, our own viewpoints, and challenging some of our biases, checking our privilege at the door, as Tahoe was unable to do at Princeton. Thinking systemically. So if someone is talking about one of these issues of racism or homophobia or classism or someone being against a person who's disabled, thinking the fact that this is systemic in nature. It's not just individual acts of meanness or kindness that determines this stuff. This stuff has legacy, continues to have legacy today. The last point I mentioned, cultural relativism, and intercultural communication. Suspend your own judgment such that you create dialogue among different and diverse groups. So think of these as the foundations in this model, and these filter then up to the next phase, which would be collective visioning. And I would suggest here notions of social justice or human rights, a collective vision of privilege in connection with social justice. And back a couple of years ago, a few of you may have attended this, I did a seminar here at the college for staff on social justice in the classroom. And this was one of the slides I suggested here, and you'll notice here, I suggested to focus on community, that all of us have a role to play, students, classmates, staff, faculty, administrators, directors, board members, and this was offered as a worksheet. So I said, can you think about some of these issues of social justice in your everyday lives? How about in these arenas, the personal and the social? What you do on social media, on your blog, when you're at the grocery store, when you're driving in the car, whether or not you choose to flip someone off, they cut you off in your car, right? Those everyday acts that, that you do in your life. What do you do in your community? Groups you're involved with. Collective visioning and bridge building that maybe you do in your local community. Your classroom or work area in which you interact with others. How do you respond to people on an everyday basis? And then at the institutional level, some of your committees that you do, I know the committees that faculty love, right? All those exciting committees, but are there issues within these various arenas of our everyday lives relative to who we are in our positions at the college that we can look at, address, and build on? And so this was something I offered back then, and I think it still has some relevance today when we talk about issues of social justice and human rights. That's that collective visioning, and that's what Dr. Maria was very able to address here in her introduction today, was to say, how can we do this today? How can we do this as a college, as a community, liaise with K-12 and make connections there as well, and all of our arenas that intersect in various ways here in Lake Tahoe. And then that leads then to the last and the most challenging. This is transformation, specifically achieving a new vision of society, achieving the type of college, the type of community that we want to be more inclusive to Latinos, to be more inclusive to people who are dealing with denials of privilege and people who are dealing with direct forms of oppression. So this might be one way of looking at some of these issues as we move forward. But I want to close on the work of someone who's very important to me and someone I talk about frequently in my classes, the late Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci. And Gramsci was certainly a key figure. If you open up any sociology or political science textbook, there's going to be one or two paragraphs, maybe a good part of a chapter, that focuses on the legacy of Gramsci. And Gramsci was very influential in terms of creating Italy's Communist Party, and unfortunately he also lived during the time of Mussolini, the fascists, and we all maybe know from our history lessons what Mussolini did in terms of his conspiring with Hitler and the Nazis, his creation of this cult of personality within Italy, tearing apart the social fabric, letting black shirts, these thugs loose on activists like the communists that Gramsci was working with to try to create collective justice in society. And Gramsci, unfortunately, for his views, was punished. And in a very telling moment in the in 1926, I believe, he was being tried by this fascist court, and the fascist judge at the time said, and this shows you how challenging it is to deal with this stuff and why intellectuals and politically minded activists like Gramsci are a threat to society and systems of privilege and domination. What the judge said at the hearing was, we must stop this mind, this brain of Gramsci's from functioning for at least 20 years. And indeed, the court passed a very severe sentence, a 20-year sentence. Gramsci was released a bit later, after 6 or so years, and died shortly after that, in no small part due to his health that deteriorated while he was in prison. And you might think like, well, maybe that judge was successful. Maybe that judge indeed stopped this intellectual, stopped his mind from functioning. In fact, it didn't work. And while Gramsci was in prison, he produced volumes, 30 different volumes of work, over 3,000 pages of political writings. Today we often refer to these as the prison notebooks, and indeed he wrote these while he was in prison. But I think what Gramsci's work does is testify to the fact that there is a value in looking at this stuff. There's a value in taking an intellectual and critical approach. And we were talking about blue jeans earlier. Gramsci was a blue jeans intellectual. He didn't believe that educators should be these intelligentsia, these folks in the community in the ivory tower. He thought, indeed, metaphorically, they should be wearing blue jeans, they should be out in the community. Everybody, Gramsci said, is an intellectual or has the capacity to be an intellectual and to be critical. And I closed then on one of his, what for me is one of his most important statements. Gramsci, when he was asked about, how do you keep going? How do you do this? I mean, most of us haven't experienced prison. Most of us haven't been thrown in jail because of our ideas and because of what we were trying to accomplish in terms of our politics and activism and intellectual work. And Gramsci said very appropriately, I'm a pessimist of the intellect, but I'm an optimist of the will. And what he meant by this was that if you're a pessimist of the intellect, indeed, it's disturbing to look at reality. If you look at the reality around you, you realize, yeah, it's pretty bad out there. It's definitely not a nice place to look at when you look at those images of Ferguson. He says, yeah, it can get very depressing and disturbing, and it's a challenge to even think about and comprehend about how people can be involved in these systems of domination and privilege that we were talking about today. But he says, even though I'm a pessimist of the intellect, I'm not going to think about just my glass is half full. I'm going to be an optimist of the will. And by being an optimist of the will, he suggests that you can use your will combined with your intellect, with that pessimism, to think about the possibility and the moral desirability of social change. So if I can leave this beginning of many, many conversations today with Gramsci's notion, I think we see the challenge ahead of us, but there are opportunities for all of us in terms of the optimism that we can collectively create in terms of our will for social justice and checking privilege in our own regards. So, thank you.
Thanks, everybody. So now it is lunchtime. We have 30 minutes just right outside. Oh, just a minute. Hold on. Hold lunch.
Okay, so we have sandwiches out here. Sorry, it's not a fancy lunch, but it's food. You don't have 30 minutes. That's why I'm stopping you, because we're going to lose Jeff Duncan Andrade at 2 o'clock. So please get back in by 12:30 if you can, please.
Yeah.